South East Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
South East Radio.
Well, on the 1st of July last, new regulations were introduced to govern the growing number of short-term lettings. But what will these regulations mean in practice? RTE journalist Brian Finn joins me on the phone now to tell us about the potential repercussions of these new regulations. Brian, you recently wrote an article about the changes to the regulations governing short-term lettings. But before we discuss the new regulations and what they mean, perhaps you can tell us why the government went about introducing these.
Well, I suppose, Karl, this goes all the way back to the crash and the years that followed, and we basically stopped building houses in this country. We weren't building them in great volumes at all, and that had an impact on not only the housing market, but it had a knock-on impact on the rental market. And I suppose in a form of a perfect storm, we had the development of websites like Airbnb and Booking.com, which started advertising short-term rentals. But like with a lot of these things, they became professionalized, and soon investors started putting whole properties on the market, and that, the government believes, has had a knock-on impact on the rental market. So at a time when you've got fewer properties available because we haven't been building as many houses, you also had this knock-on problem where we had fewer houses again because a lot of them were going onto the short-term rental market. So this is why they believed that they had to address this problem.
The new regulations came into effect earlier this month. So does this essentially put an end to rental homes being used as short-term lets?
So there's a number of different categories, if you like. So if we go back to the original idea of renting out a room in your house, that still applies. So you can continue to do that, and under the B&B regulations, you can get an exemption, if you like. But you, under the new regulations, you are supposed to inform your local authority that you are doing this. Now, in the next level up, for example, people might have rented out their house when they went on holidays. So it might have helped pay for your holidays, for example. So you go for 2 weeks to France and you decide to put your house up on Airbnb for those 2 weeks. Now, there's a slight restriction has been introduced here in that you can only do that now for 90 days in the year and for 14 days at a time. So you get about 6 2-week stints out of that, if you like, which is generous enough. It allows you to perhaps pay for the holiday and to put your house out for a period of time. Now, what they're really trying to clamp down on is individuals putting entire houses, so an investment property, on the market because it's quite profitable for the individuals, but particularly in the rent pressure zones. That's mostly the cities around the country where there are really problems in the letting sector. This is where they're trying to clamp down. And from now on, under these new regulations that came in on July 1st, you have to apply to your local council or your local authority to get permission to put your house on the market. And it means a change of planning permission. So your house moves from being a domestic property to being a residential property. Now, if you are in one of those rent pressure zones, which is mainly the cities around the country, the chances of them granting you that planning permission are slim. So most likely you'll be told either put the house back on the short-term rental market or decide what you're going to do with it.
Brian, how will this be policed by the local authorities?
Well, the local authorities have been tasked with doing it themselves. Now, Dublin City Council estimated that it would need about €750,000 to take on more staff. Now, the Department of Housing confirmed that they had provided extra allocations to Dublin City Council to do this. They said they had given them sufficient money to take on 12 individuals who could police this. But according to, there's a website called Inside Airbnb, and they keep an eye on what's happening on Airbnb. And according to them, there's about 10,000 properties at the moment listed on Airbnb, and just over half of those are full properties, so they're full apartments or full houses. So that means that that 12 staff that Dublin City Council will be taking on to police this will have a hell of a lot of work to do, because in the best case scenario, if all of those individuals register and say we have a full property on Airbnb and we're seeking a change of planning permission, it's going to be a lot of paperwork to go through in a best case scenario. In a worst case scenario, they're going to have to go out and find those individuals who have properties on the likes of the short-term rental pages, determine how long they're renting the properties for, they determine ownership. So there's a lot of work involved in this.
Now, as you said to me earlier in the interview, people can rent out their homes for up to 14 days at a time and up to a maximum of 90 days in any one calendar year. But this is going to be very hard to track for local authorities.
It is, and that's part of the problem, in that if individuals don't come forward and provide proof and tell them this is what we're doing, they have to. The onus is on them to go and find out how long individuals have been letting them out for. Are they adhering to the 2 week terms? It is very difficult to police.
And for those property owners that have engaged in short-term lettings and intend to do so into the future, for those that don't engage with their local authority in relation to this, what are the penalties and consequences for them?
The penalties are quite stiff, in that in the first instance, if you're found not to be adhering to the regulations, you can be fined up to €5,000. Beyond that, if you've been given notice and you continue to flout the regulations, you can be charged up to €1,500 for every day that you continue to do so. Following that, you can get a term in prison up to 6 months.
And are there any changes to the tax implications of renting on a short-term basis?
There's no change to the tax implications. There always were tax implications there, if you like, and indeed Revenue and Airbnb, for example, have been working together in finding out how much people earn on the Airbnb service. So if you are renting out a property on Airbnb, you really should be declaring it to Revenue. The taxation elements they're quite severe, in that if you're a high earner, for example, if you're at the top rate of tax, you will be charged for your Airbnb rentals at that top rate of tax. It could be up to 52%, comprising about 40% of the top rate of income tax, and then there's PRSI and there's USC on top of that. So you could be charged taxation of up to 52%. The other thing to keep in mind is there are a number of charges associated with changing your house from a domestic property to a commercial property. In the first instance, if you're looking to change planning permission, you could be looking at a charge of around €200 for an apartment in order to change the listing of the apartment, or up to €600 for a house. And then there's also commercial rates on top of that. So you will be charged for water because your property is now a commercial property.
This legislation has come about as a result of the growth in Airbnb. But what does Airbnb have to say about this?
Well, Airbnb, for example, argue that there are about 250,000 vacant properties around the country. Now, if you take the Dublin figures again, for example, if there are about 10,000 properties or 10,000 offerings on Airbnb, about 5,000 of those are full properties. So their argument is 5,000 in the context of 250,000, it doesn't really make much of a difference. And there is a certain element of truth in that. However, these the vacant property figures are based on what the CSO calculate at census time. Now, there will always be a segment of the housing population that will be out of use for various reasons. People may be in nursing homes, the houses may be undergoing renovation, they may be in the process of litigation, going through divorce. There's all kinds of examples why houses might be vacant at a particular period in time, but that number will stay fairly consistent. And if you look at this from another point of view, for example, if you look at daft.ie, they say that on the 1st of May this year, according to their most recent report, there were around 1,200 properties available for rent in Dublin, which is a very low figure. So if you were to release that 5,000 properties that are on Airbnb back onto the short-term rental market, that would go a long way towards alleviating the rent problem in Dublin. Now, Airbnb and Booking.com and a lot of the other providers will argue that they're not the worst of the problem. There are other issues at play here. For example, we really need to be building more houses, and that's at the nub of the issue here. We built about 18,000 housing units last year. We need to be building, economists estimate, around 30 to 35,000 houses to keep up with demand. We're probably on course to build around 20 to 22,000 this year. So that's really where they need to be tackling this problem, is to build more housing.
Now, the Minister for Housing and, of course, the overall government will be hoping that these new regulations will curb the original problem, forcing landlords to favour the long-term rental market. But how realistic is that?
Well, this is the point that the Property Owners Association say. They say that the aim of this is to get housing from the short-term rental market back into the long-term market. Now, the Property Owners Association argue that a lot of individuals who are letting out their properties on short-term rentals, they're not doing it for the love of it. They're doing it because it's a profitable sector. It's a profitable business. And they may have very big borrowings, and for a lot of them, this is the only reason why they do it. So there's no guarantee that they will take the houses from the short-term sector and put them back into the long-term rental sector. They may end up selling the houses. Now, that may have an impact in turn on providing more housing for the housing market, but it may not provide the solution that the government were originally intending.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Brian Finn from RTE, and I would like to thank Brian for discussing the implications of these new regulations with us this morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
South